They had nothing. No tools, no rights, no freedom. So they built everything anyway. 42 inventions born inside the worst places on Earth, and most of what you think you know about them is completely wrong. 1. Everyone pictures the prison shiv as a jagged scrap of metal scraped desperately against concrete by someone with nothing left to lose and no plan beyond the next 5 minutes. That image is doing a lot of flattering work for the institution and almost none for the person they're containing. Documented confiscations at maximum security facilities across the country have pulled weapons with wrapped ergonomic handles, tapered points ground to near surgical geometry, and weight distribution that suggests someone spent real time thinking about balance. The materials list reads like a deranged engineering catalog: melted chess pieces reformed into handles, toothbrushes heated and bent into functional blade guards, layered magazine pages compressed until they're hard enough to serve as grips. The metallurgical variety alone should embarrass people who think desperation produces crude results. Aluminum from crushed cans, steel harvested from bed frames, copper wire braided into blades rigid enough to punch through denim without folding. Correctional officers at multiple facilities have documented weapons so refined they have required specific cataloging beyond the standard sharp object classification, noting grip type, blade geometry, and probable construction method. This isn't a panic weapon assembled in 5 minutes. This is a capstone project with a material selection phase, a fabrication phase, and a finishing phase. The only difference between this and a product launch is the distribution channel and the target demographic. 2. The prison tattoo exists in the cultural imagination as a symbol of identity, someone declaring who they are against a system that stripped away everything else. Pure self-expression burned into skin using whatever was available. That reading is sentimental and almost entirely wrong about the original function. The prison tattoo machine was invented primarily as a communication system, not an art movement. Early documented machines, traced to Soviet-era labor camps in the 1940s and 50s, were used to encode gang affiliation, criminal history, and sentence length in visual shorthand that other inmates could read instantly on sight. A wearable resume designed for rapid credentialing in environments where asking questions the wrong way got people killed. The machines themselves were built from electric razor motors, stripped from institutional grooming equipment, guitar string needles, and ink made from soot, scraped off the bottoms of tin cups and mixed with urine as a binding agent. In American facilities through the 70s and 80s, confiscated machines were regularly constructed from ballpoint pen barrels, cassette player motors salvaged from donated electronics and sharpened staples, components selected specifically because they appeared harmless during standard searches. Russian criminal tattoo scholars documented entire visual encyclopedias of meaning where placement on the body was as significant as the image itself, a single symbol on the chest, reading entirely differently from the same symbol on the hand. They didn't invent a tattoo gun. They invented a professional credentialing system that runs on soot and institutional oversight's complete inability to read the code. 3. Every prison is monitored, every cafeteria tray accounted for, every piece of fruit tracked from kitchen to table. The institutional assumption is that this level of control makes fermentation impossible, that you cannot produce functional alcohol inside a facility designed to prevent exactly that. This assumption has been independently proven wrong at virtually every correctional institution on the planet, often within weeks of the facility opening. Classic Pruno, the documented prison wine that has been reinvented in essentially every jail, prison, and detention center with access to a cafeteria, requires fruit from meal trays, ketchup packets for sugar content, bread for wild yeast, and water sealed in a plastic bag and stored near warm plumbing. Fermentation takes between 48 and 72 hours and produces alcohol content, estimated anywhere from 2% to 14% depending on temperature, sugar load, and how long the process runs, a range that overlaps with commercially sold wine at the upper end. A documented botulism outbreak at a Utah correctional facility in 2004 was traced directly to Pruno, hospitalizing multiple inmates and proving conclusively that the recipe had evolved enough to achieve real microbial complexity, which is a sentence that should haunt every facility administrator who ever thought controlled meal distribution solved anything. The concealment methods rival the brew itself: bags sewn into mattress seams, containers hidden inside hollowed library books, fermentation time to hit peak alcohol content during the gaps between scheduled inspection sweeps. They didn't just make alcohol in prison, they invented artisanal craft brewing 40 years before it became a marketing category with significantly worse hygiene and considerably higher personal stakes. 4. The lockpick in prison is synonymous with one thing in every movie ever made about the subject: escape. Someone scrapes a piece of metal into a thin probe, defeats a lock, and runs. The lockpick is the symbol of the great escape fantasy, the one object that represents freedom. The documented reality is that the majority of prison-made lockpicks were never pointed at an exterior door. They were used on other inmates' cells, on storage lockers, on supply cabinets, for theft, leverage, and protection, not liberation. Confiscated picks recovered at maximum security facilities were made from bobby pins, paper clips, thin aluminum strips cut from soda can lids, and in at least one documented case, the metal spine stripped from a hardcover book. Interior cell locks in older facilities were notoriously simple mechanisms, some designed in the 1930s, making them trivially vulnerable to improvised tools that a patient person could produce in under 10 minutes. The primary documented use cases include accessing other inmates' commissary storage, entering unoccupied cells to plant contraband or weapons, and in several documented incidents, accessing guard station supply rooms for medication. The technical knowledge of lock mechanics circulated through inmate populations with the efficiency of a trade apprenticeship, passed verbally and demonstrated on practice locks carved from soap. Nobody was picking their way to freedom, they were picking their way to someone else's ramen noodles. Same mechanical skill, significantly lower ambition, considerably higher day-to-day practical value. 5. The image is permanent. Bedsheets knotted together, dangling from a high window, someone climbing down into the dark toward whatever counts as freedom from where they're standing. It's the prison escape image. It's also a reliable way to fall to your death. Standard prison issue cotton bedsheets fail at seam points under loads exceeding 180 pounds, which is the average weight of an adult male, meaning the mythology of the bedsheet escape is structurally built on material that frequently kills the person using it. Studies of documented escape attempts involving improvised rope consistently find catastrophic failure rates at the weakest structural points, which are always the seams and always the first thing to go under dynamic load. Successful rope-based escapes have used dental floss braided into core supports for high tensile strength, with near zero visibility on inspection, uniform fabric torn and twisted using military survival cordage patterns, and knotted plastic strip material sourced from food service packaging. The 1962 Alcatraz escape, still the most analyzed prison break in American correctional history, involved rope made partly from raincoat material, not bed sheets, demonstrating that effective improvised cordage required deliberate material selection based on weight tolerance, not just proximity to the laundry. Knotting technique matters at least as much as material. A square knot slips under sustained load, a Prusik hitch does not, and inmates with military or maritime backgrounds are documented as disproportionately successful in rope-based attempts for exactly this reason. The bedsheet rope is the prison escape version of a participation trophy. It looks like a plan right up until it meets gravity and a seam inspection at the same time. 6. You picture a plastic spoon, years of patient scratching, dirt moved one painful handful at a time by someone with nothing but time and stubbornness. Tunneling out of prison is the ultimate slow burn brute force story, all grit and no sophistication. That picture is wrong in almost every specific detail. Documented prison tunnels have included structural reinforcement systems, functional ventilation shafts, and directional accuracy achieved using instruments that would have been impressive in a surveying context, let alone a correctional one. The 1984 Maze prison escape in Northern Ireland, involving 38 prisoners and representing the largest escape in British correctional history, featured a tunnel with reinforced walls, a ventilation shaft constructed from cardboard tubes, and a directional strategy based on covertly obtained architectural information about the facility layout. Inmates at multiple Brazilian facilities have been documented using simple triangulation, counting floor tiles from known reference points to map subterranean routes without any instruments at all. The soil removal problem, which kills most tunneling attempts not through discovery but through the logistical impossibility of hiding excavated earth, was solved during the Stalag Luft 3 escape of 1944 by a dispersal system where inmates wore long underwear stuffed with excavated soil, releasing it through a slit in the fabric while walking the exercise yard, dispersing tons of earth over months without triggering detection. Shoring systems in documented tunnels used carved wooden supports from bed slats, flattened tin cans as wall paneling, and in one documented South American case, a framework built entirely from stolen plumbing pipe. This wasn't digging. This was infrastructure development conducted without permits, licensing, or the option of bringing in a subcontractor. 7. The contraband cell phone feels like a product of the smartphone era, a headache that correctional administrators couldn't have anticipated 15 years ago, a problem born from miniaturization and consumer electronics proliferation. The documented record says otherwise. Inmates have been building and exploiting functional communication systems from available components since the era of rotary phones, and the ingenuity predates the modern handset by several decades. Documented cases from the 80s and 90s include inmates wiring directly into institutional telephone infrastructure, accessing junction boxes and maintenance corridors to splice listening devices or make unauthorized calls through existing lines without generating billing records that would flag the activity. In more recent documented cases, confiscated contraband phones have arrived with the external casing completely removed and all components wrapped in electrical tape to reduce profile to the minimum dimension required to pass through specific body cavities or fit inside hollowed books with pages cut out in the precise shape of the component stack. A 2018 South Carolina facility report documented over 1,000 contraband phones confiscated in a single year, a number that suggests not individual smuggling, but a systematic external supply chain with internal coordination sophisticated enough to move inventory at that volume consistently. Jamming technology deployed by facilities has been documented as being outpaced by inmates switching to devices operating on frequencies outside the jammer's coverage range. A documented technological arms race in which the institution's procurement cycle consistently runs slower than the adaptation cycle on the other side of the wall. Silicon Valley thinks it invented mobile communication. It just built better hardware for a problem that was already solved. 8. A serious weapon needs to be metal. Everyone accepts this without really thinking about it. Plastic is for packaging and children's toys. Metal is for tools and threats. Metal detectors are the institutional response to this reality, and they work. Except for all the weapons that aren't metal. Documented categories of non-metallic prison weapons include hardened plastic instruments produced by melting multiple plastic utensils together, molding the compound against a flat surface, and allowing it to cool under sustained pressure until it achieves a density and rigidity that passes through standard metal detection without registering anything at all. Ceramic compounds, available through ceramic hobby programs offered at some facilities as rehabilitative programming, have been used to produce blade edges technically sharper than steel and completely transparent to detection equipment calibrated for ferrous and non-ferrous metals. A documented category referred to in correctional reports as newspaper weapons involves soaking pages in water, compressing them under mattress weight, drying them completely, and repeating the process until the resulting material has the density and structural integrity of low-grade composite board, hard enough to cause significant blunt trauma. Glass weapons sourced from broken institutional windows or mirror fragments have been documented with handles wrapped in cloth strips, producing a functional instrument with the hand geometry of a professional cutting tool. Metal detectors solve the metal problem efficiently and completely. They do not solve the creativity problem, which is the one that was always going to matter more in an environment where the population has unlimited time to think about the difference. 9. Solitary confinement is the institutional equivalent of a hard reset. No contact, no materials, no coordination, no production. A sterile box that stops everything. The documented reality of what gets produced in solitary confinement is one of the more uncomfortable entries in this entire catalog because it turns out that extreme isolation combined with unlimited unstructured time produces some of the most refined improvised engineering in correctional history. Accounts from solitary confinement survivors across multiple facilities describe using fingernails to carve writing instruments from soap bars, producing functional styli capable of pressing legible text into paper or inscribing messages into wall surfaces. Instruments made entirely from thread pulled from uniform seams, braided over thousands of hours, into cords with documented tensile strength, sufficient to function as binding material or suspension line, have been recovered from solitary cells. The controlled drip of water from plumbing fixtures has been documented as a slow erosion tool, used to gradually sharpen points on metal fixture bolts over periods of weeks, producing a functional sharp instrument using nothing but patience, water, and the basic physics of abrasion. At least one documented case involved an inmate in extended solitary producing a functional lockpick from a single staple smuggled in with legal mail, bending it with fingernails over weeks to the exact geometry required to operate the door mechanism. Solitary confinement doesn't eliminate ingenuity, it removes the distractions. In practice, it functions as a silent residency for people who want to build something and suddenly have nothing else to do. 10. The improvised crystal radio is a romantic image. A prisoner secretly listening to the outside world through a handmade receiver, maintaining some fragile connection to everything beyond the wall. Music from somewhere free. It's a moving picture. It's also the wrong picture, because the primary documented value of prison-built radios was intelligence collection, not sentiment. Inmates use them to monitor guard communication frequencies, map institutional schedules, and anticipate facility shakedowns before the sweep teams reach their cells. Crystal radio sets require no power source whatsoever. They run entirely off the electromagnetic energy of incoming radio waves, making them undetectable through the power consumption monitoring that was the primary detection method available to facilities through the 1970s. The components required are almost insultingly accessible: wire coiled around a cardboard tube, a galena crystal or a razor blade treated with pencil graphite as a detector, a single wire run along a metal bed frame as an antenna. All of it survives standard contraband searches because none of it looks like anything other than what it's made from. Oral histories from mid-20th century federal facilities document inmates using AM reception to track weather patterns, specifically to time escape attempts around reduced perimeter visibility during low light conditions. More sophisticated transistor versions, built from components sourced through donated electronics or educational programs, extended range into the VHF frequencies used by institutional communication systems, a security vulnerability documented at several facilities before electronics donation policies were revised. They weren't listening to love songs. They were running signals intelligence on the organization that held them. The guards thought they were nostalgic. They were operational. 11. Prison disguises live in the theatrical imagination: a stolen uniform, a fake mustache assembled from collected hair, something that fools no one for more than 30 seconds. Obvious, desperate, almost comedic. The documented record of actual disguise attempts involves levels of prosthetic fabrication, material science application, and behavioral preparation that belong in a professional production context, not a slapstick one. The 1988 Arizona State Prison escape by Troy Pruitt involved a dummy built over months from papier-mâché and painted with skin tone pigment. Mixed from cafeteria condiments, positioned in his bed during night counts to create a 12-hour window before absence was detected. Mask fabrication in correctional facilities has been documented using latex sourced from rubber gloves built up in successive layers over a plaster mold produced from toilet paper pulp, creating masks capable of surviving visual inspection at low light distances, sufficient to pass security camera review. Hair alteration using institutional bleach compounds and dye sourced from art supply programs has been documented as part of deliberate appearance change strategies timed to coincide with mass processing events where individual scrutiny is reduced by volume. Behavioral preparation, specifically the practice of mimicking the gait, posture, and verbal delivery patterns of particular staff members or contractors, has been documented in post-capture interviews as a deliberate practice refined over weeks of systematic observation during authorized movement periods. This isn't a costume, it's a character study with a prosthetics budget, a production timeline measured in months, and an opening night with a very specific and unforgiving performance review. 12. The institutional assumption underlying every security hardware upgrade is that the lock wins. Modern correctional locking hardware is engineered by specialists whose entire professional purpose is preventing defeat by the population being contained. The documented track record of that assumption is not encouraging. Every lock generation deployed in correctional facilities has been defeated by improvised means within a documented time frame that in several cases was shorter than the procurement and deployment cycle for the next countermeasure. Electromagnetic locks, marketed as the gold standard in modern facility security, have been defeated in documented cases through magnetic interference produced by improvised electromagnets built from coiled wire and battery sources extracted from contraband electronics. Mechanical pin tumbler locks have been defeated using picks made from guitar strings and, in one documented case, a technique involving plastic wrap pressed into the keyhole to capture a geometric impression of the pin configuration, standard lock sport methodology executed without purpose-built equipment. Timed electronic locks have been gamed by inmates who identified a maintenance service window during which the system defaulted to a fail-open state. A vulnerability discovered through patient behavioral observation rather than technical knowledge of the system architecture. Door frame defeats, where the locking cylinder is bypassed entirely by attacking the frame material, have been documented using tools no more sophisticated than a sharpened toothbrush handle applied to aging wood or corroded metal over sustained periods. The lock isn't the last line of defense, it's the first problem. And the population studying it professionally has one resource that the engineers who designed it will never match: unlimited unscheduled time with no other agenda. 13. You can't gamble without equipment, and equipment is contraband. No cards, no dice, no physical tokens of any kind. Institutional policy has apparently solved the gambling problem by eliminating the tools gambling requires. The documented prison gambling economy disagrees with this analysis in comprehensive and somewhat impressive detail. Verbal gambling systems tracked entirely through collective memory have been documented as primary wagering mechanisms in facilities where all physical gaming items were prohibited, with inmates maintaining running tallies of debts, odds, and outcomes across dozens of participants with zero written record and zero physical evidence for a search team to recover. Dice have been produced from soap compressed into cubes and hardened over time, from rubber eraser material carved with improvised tools, and from bread dough pressed into shape and baked hard against institutional heat vents, all producing functional random number generators that pass the basic requirement of being unpredictable. Playing cards have been produced from cereal box cardboard, painted with improvised ink, a deck requiring approximately 40 hours of skilled labor and capable of surviving months of regular use before degrading past function. Sports betting systems using institutional television access to live broadcast events have been documented as the most economically significant gambling operations within any given facility, using commissary goods as currency and operating with bookmaking sophistication that includes spread calculation and documented risk management strategies. They didn't need equipment, they needed math, memory, and a shared agreement about what constitutes a binding commitment. Two of those three are free, and the third one is enforced more reliably inside than it is in most legitimate financial markets. 14. Every contraband weapon in the institutional imagination exists for one purpose: offensive violence. Something made to threaten, to hurt, or to kill. The weapon and the intended harm are inseparable in the way the subject is discussed, studied, and managed by correctional administration. The documented criminological reality is that the majority of improvised weapons recovered during non-incident searches, meaning found during routine shakedowns rather than as evidence of an assault, were never used in violence and were not made with offensive intent as the primary motivation. Research on inmate weapon possession consistently finds that the dominant reported motivation for carrying is protection from anticipated violence, a dynamic that mirrors civilian defensive carry psychology almost exactly. Display weapons, instruments produced specifically to be visible or rumored about rather than deployed, have been documented as a deliberate deterrence strategy. An inmate known to possess a weapon encounters fewer unsolicited challenges than one known to be unarmed, regardless of whether the weapon ever leaves the cell. Some of the most elaborate documented weapons recovered during facility searches, carefully constructed objects with significant labor investment, were found on inspection to have edges intentionally left dull, functioning purely as psychological instruments with no offensive capacity. The economic value of a weapon within the internal prison economy extends well beyond its potential for use. Weapons have been documented as loan collateral, status signals, and in long-term holding situations, as currency in debt resolution without either party ever touching them in violence. The most effective prison weapon is one that never gets used, which is exactly the same deterrence doctrine the world's nuclear-armed governments have been running on for decades. 15. You aim roughly away from the wall and start digging and hope you end up somewhere useful. The tunneling mythology is essentially directional hope plus manual labor, with success determined by luck and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. The documented accuracy of actual prison tunnels built under operational conditions destroys this picture efficiently. The Stalag Luft 3 tunnel, designated Harry, analyzed in exhaustive post-war military engineering assessments, maintained directional accuracy within 2 feet across a 336-foot total length, achieved using a compass made from a magnetized razor blade suspended in water inside a paper bowl. That is a surveying result that compares favorably with consumer-grade instruments of the same era. Depth calculation was performed using knotted string lowered from known reference points, allowing inmates to calculate the vertical profile of the tunnel relative to surface features mapped through observation of guard movement patterns and vegetation above the excavation path. Structural decisions, where to reinforce walls, where to leave natural soil columns for stability, How wide to make the passage for the specific body profiles of the people who would use it were made based on soil type analysis performed by rubbing earth between fingers to assess clay content and compression resistance, a technique used by professional geotechnical assessors under different circumstances. Distance tracking in complete darkness was accomplished by counting body lengths crawled, each participant having memorized the precise measurement of their own prone reach, cross-referenced with the cadence count used to time the air pump strokes that kept the ventilation system functional. They surveyed a 300-foot underground structure using a razor blade, a string, and careful counting. Consumer GPS recalculates 3 times on a road trip with satellite coverage and map data. 16. A raft built from prison materials is a flotation device for someone who has stopped doing the math on survival. Plastic bottles and trash bag scraps, maybe some tape, something that gets you wet and tired before it gets you anywhere useful. Naval engineers and correctional administrators have generally agreed on this point. The documented physical evidence from the most analyzed prison water escape in American history suggests they were wrong. The 1962 Alcatraz escape involved a raft constructed from over 50 rubber raincoat sections bonded together using steam from institutional radiator pipes, a cold vulcanization process that produced waterproof seams strong enough to survive open bay conditions, according to forensic analysis of recovered fragments conducted years after the escape. The paddle assembly was built from plywood sections taken from institutional equipment, shaped and fitted with grips, in a way that demonstrates intentional ergonomic consideration rather than last-minute improvisation on the beach. Naval architects who reviewed the Alcatraz escape materials and declassified federal investigation documents concluded the raft was likely functional for the intended crossing distance, a finding that directly revised the long-standing institutional position that the escapees necessarily drowned. Buoyancy calculations for the craft have been found in confiscated prisoner writings that predate the escape attempt, documenting displacement weight ratios calculated using institutional physics textbooks and applied to material selection decisions. The Coast Guard spent decades insisting that raft couldn't float. The Pacific Ocean has not officially weighed in, which remains the more interesting data point. 17. Prison tattoo ink is whatever was nearest when someone decided to start. Soot, dirt, whatever the moment produced. The medium is accidental, the chemistry is irrelevant, and the result reflects both of those facts. Documented ink formulations from correctional facilities across multiple countries and eras demonstrate something considerably more deliberate than that. The primary pigment in documented prison inks, carbon black produced from controlled burning of available organic materials, was not selected at random. Carbon black is chemically inert and resistant to the macrophage absorption process that causes other pigments to fade over time in dermal tissue, meaning it remains visible longer than organic alternatives. This is the same technical property that professional tattoo ink manufacturers rely on for the same reason, and the documented selection of this specific compound in correctional contexts suggests either fortunate convergence or the circulation of technical knowledge within the population. Binding agents used in documented prison inks include glycerin sourced from soap, manufacturing byproducts, which reduces viscosity and allows the compound to flow through an improvised needle at lower pressure, directly reducing skin trauma during application. Color has been achieved through documented chemical creativity. Blue-green pigment from copper compounds scraped from aged plumbing fittings, red from crushed institutional vitamin capsules, and in multiple documented cases, professional-grade pigment smuggled through visitation inside hollowed cosmetic containers. Sterilization attempts, crude but intentional, have included flame treatment of needle components, immersion in rubbing alcohol sourced from medical supply kits, and in documented cases, using the alcohol content of fermented institutional brew as a disinfecting medium before application. They didn't grab a rock and start, they formulated a compound. The chemistry is better than some products currently available at retail. 18. You slide a note under a door. You whisper through a vent. Prison communication is medieval in pace and leaky by nature, easily intercepted by anyone paying attention, and practically impossible to encrypt using available materials. The documented inmate communication infrastructure across multiple institutions and eras operates on principles of speed, redundancy, and encoded content that mirror the design requirements of professional intelligence tradecraft, rather than medieval correspondence. The fishing line system, documented in facilities across multiple countries, involves a network of threads run through ventilation gaps and under door clearances, passing physical notes across multiple cells in under 60 seconds, faster than a standard guard patrol rotation. Coded tap communication using shared wall surfaces follows patterns documented as early as the 1800s in Tsarist Russian detention facilities, a positional cipher where wall taps correspond to letter coordinates in a memorized grid, transmitting complete sentences at speeds exceeding 30 words per minute in practiced hands. Visual signal systems using window reflections, strategically positioned objects visible from specific angles, and controlled light exposure through door gaps have been documented as operational channels requiring zero physical contact between participants and leaving zero recoverable evidence for investigators. Layered message encoding in written correspondence, where an innocuous surface message conceals a coded message embedded in letter spacing, word selection, or punctuation patterns, has been documented in institutional mail analysis, driving facilities to deploy linguistic software specifically designed to detect it. They invented encrypted peer-to-peer communication decades before the protocol existed as a technical concept. The only meaningful difference is the latency and the sentencing exposure. 19, someone snaps. An opportunity appears, and they run. The escape mythology is built on the spontaneous break, the moment of desperate, unplanned action that overcomes everything through sheer urgency. The documented structure of the most successful correctional escapes in modern history reads nothing like that. It reads like a project management document with dependencies, resource allocation tables, and a critical path. The 1984 Maze prison escape in Northern Ireland involved 14 months of documented preparation, including the covert acquisition of a firearm smuggled through visitation over multiple visits. The fabrication of transport authorization documents, indistinguishable from official materials under non-forensic inspection, and the coordinated takeover of a cell block using a precisely timed sequence involving 38 participants with pre-assigned individual roles. Task specialization in large documented escape operations has been found to mirror military unit structure. Scouts assigned to perimeter surveillance, fabricators responsible for tools and disguise components, logistics coordinators managing material flow and timing, and designated decoys responsible for creating cover narratives and distractions during the operational window. Operational security within planning groups has been documented as a primary organizational concern, with information about the attempt compartmentalized so that no single participant held the complete picture, limiting the damage of any individual being turned by institutional informant recruitment. Timing selection has been documented as a deliberate analytical process. Escape windows chosen based on staff rotation patterns, seasonal weather conditions, external events creating distraction or reduced perimeter staffing, and institutional behavioral routines identified through months of systematic observation. This was not an impulse. It was a project plan. The only thing that distinguishes it from professional operations management is the setting and what happens if the deadline slips. 20. Weapons-grade chemistry requires a laboratory. Prisons have mops, industrial soap, and cafeteria condiments. The gap between those two things is the safety margin the institution relies on when it decides the cleaning supply closet isn't a security concern. That safety margin has been closed in documented incident reports from correctional facilities in multiple countries. Cocktail weapons, mixtures of institutional cleaning fluids combined to produce toxic gas or caustic liquid projectors, have been documented as thrown weapons in multiple facility assault incidents. Combinations of bleach and ammonia-based cleaners produce chloramine gas, a compound that causes severe respiratory distress even in brief exposure at the concentrations achievable from institutional supply volumes. Biological contamination weapons, documented in correctional officer assault records under the clinical designation gassing, involve fermented organic waste stored in sealed containers and deployed as thrown projectiles, producing infections documented as requiring medical treatment in affected officers. Sugar-based incendiary compounds, refined from cafeteria supplies and concentrated through evaporation using heat sources available in kitchen assignment rolls, have been documented as producing combustion temperatures that exceeded the designed response range of standard institutional fire suppression equipment at close range. Caustic compounds produced by concentrating institutional soap through sustained evaporation have been documented as surface-applied chemical irritants affecting anyone who contacts the treated surface hours or days after application, a delayed action tool with no obvious attribution chain. The cleaning supply closet was never the opposite of a weapons laboratory. It was always a weapons laboratory with worse labeling and an institutional assumption that nobody inside had read the safety data sheets. 21. Cigarettes became prison currency because they were there and everyone wanted them. a circumstantial accident of supply and demand that happened to produce a functional medium of exchange. The economic analysis of why cigarettes specifically worked and what replaced them when they didn't tells a more structured story. Cigarettes were selected as institutional currency through the same logic that drove the historical selection of precious metals as monetary standards: portability, divisibility, durability, and universal recognizability within the relevant population. All four classical requirements for a functional commodity currency met simultaneously. When smoking bans were implemented across U.S. federal facilities beginning in 2004, the resulting economic vacuum was filled almost immediately by ramen noodle packets, a commodity that is non-perishable, standardized in value across production runs, divisible by portion size, and universally desirable within the institutional population. Mackerel pouches became the documented dominant currency in facilities where commissary access was more broadly restricted, a development noted in a 2008 Wall Street Journal article that described a functional mackerel standard operating across dozens of federal institutions simultaneously. Exchange rates between different commodity currencies within single facilities have been documented, a system of cross-commodity valuation equivalent to a foreign exchange market operating on protein content, caloric density, and seasonal availability of specific items. Debt instruments, denominated in commodity units, traded between third parties and bearing documented interest rates, have been recovered in confiscated materials, representing a functional credit market layered on top of the commodity base. They didn't stumble into an economy, they rebuilt one from scratch and reached the concept of commodity futures in under a decade. The only missing institution was a central bank, which is probably for everyone's benefit. 22. Professional search teams know every hiding location: under the mattress, behind the fixture, inside the seam, above the ceiling tile, behind the mirror. The institutional search is comprehensive by design, conducted by people whose professional experience is specifically the catalog of places inmates put things. The most effective documented hiding locations in correctional history were not placed in the catalog locations. They were engineered to survive the search by exploiting the specific known limitations of search protocols with architectural precision. Wall voids created by selectively loosening grout around individual tiles, then resealing the tile with a compound of soap and matching dust, produced storage spaces invisible to visual inspection and undetectable without acoustic testing of every wall surface, which is not part of the standard search protocol. False bottoms in institutional furniture produced by cutting and reseating shelf surfaces using adhesive sourced from bookbinding materials survived documented searches conducted by experienced officers who reported finding nothing because the join was matched to the existing furniture surface at inspection lighting. Ceiling fixture modification using wire tools to remove and replace light cover panels exploited the documented behavioral tendency of search personnel to prioritize surfaces at and below eye level, leaving overhead spaces consistently under-examined. Contraband has been documented in locations specifically selected for psychological counterintuitiveness, inside the frame of a family photograph provided by the institution, inside the spine of a chaplaincy-provided Bible, inside the hollow grip of an institutional cleaning implement. The search protocol found everything it expected to find. It didn't find the things designed to be invisible to expectation. That's not a security failure. That's an intelligence failure with a different solution set. 23. Handcuff escape is a Houdini problem. Years of training, specialized instruments, techniques developed over a professional career in performance and escape artistry. The general population does not pick handcuffs. The documented record of institutional handcuff defeats suggests that the general population, given sufficient motivation and a bobby pin, does approximately what a trained escape artist does, just without the theatrical staging. The standard double lock mechanism on commercial law enforcement handcuffs requires only a thin probe to depress the double lock pin before the ratchet releases, a mechanism discoverable through trial and error in under 2 hours without any prior knowledge of how the hardware was designed or manufactured. Inmates have been documented palming bobby pins during the cuffing process with sufficient consistency that high-security transfer protocols now include strip search procedures specifically targeting palmed items because the standard body search was missing them at a documented rate that required a policy response. The chicken bone defeat, documented in at least 3 separate post-incident reports from county jails, involved using the thin, hollow end of a stripped poultry bone as a shim to depress the ratchet pal while the arresting officer completed paperwork in the same room. The fastest documented defeat of a standard commercial handcuff model by an inmate using improvised tools was under 90 seconds from a starting position of hands secured behind the back, a result documented in correctional training materials as an institutional benchmark for evaluating restraint reliability. Houdini spent years perfecting the handcuff escape for a paying audience. Someone did it with a chicken bone during booking while a professional law enforcement officer sat 4 feet away. 24. Escape means breaching the perimeter, a wall, a fence, a physical barrier, the thing that has to give before anything else is possible. Every film, every documentary, every institutional case study treats the physical boundary as the core engineering challenge. The most successful documented escapes in the modern correctional era walked through the front door. In a 2013 case at a Belgian federal facility, 2 high-security prisoners were released to individuals presenting forged court documents that had been processed through standard institutional release channels by staff who had no procedural reason to question paperwork that matched official templates exactly. Template acquisition for document forgery has been documented through channels that are structurally difficult to eliminate. Legal correspondence provides official letterhead and seal impressions, court appearance paperwork, provides format and field structure, and institutional mail from administrative sources provides typeface conventions and signature block formats necessary for matching. Impersonation of legal representatives, including attorneys, social workers, and credentialed clergy, has been documented as an access vector exploited repeatedly across multiple jurisdictions, with institutional access protocols relying primarily on visual credential inspection of materials that can be fabricated with sufficient reference material and patience. The social engineering element, exploiting the documented institutional tendency to extend professional deference to individuals who display confident professional demeanor and appropriate visual markers, has been analyzed in security literature as the most consistently successful category of modern escape vector across the past 30 years. The wall was never the primary problem. The person at the front desk was the primary problem. And that person can be addressed with a confident presentation and a convincing signature on the right piece of paper. 25. Making drugs in prison requires precursor chemicals, specialized knowledge, and equipment that simply doesn't exist inside a controlled institutional environment. The supply chain ends at intake. What gets documented inside correctional facilities in terms of intoxicant production and distribution suggests the supply chain simply started over using what was already there. Nutmeg, an institutional spice available through cafeteria operations at many facilities, contains myristicin, a compound metabolized in the body to a chemical structurally related to amphetamine, producing documented psychoactive effects at doses achievable through standard food service portions if the material is consumed in concentrated form. Its documented use as a correctional intoxicant appears in medical records across multiple jurisdictions over multiple decades, suggesting the knowledge transfers reliably through inmate populations regardless of facility. Prescription medication hoarding through the practice of retaining pills during monitored distribution rather than swallowing them has produced documented institutional pharmaceutical stockpiles redistributed as contraband with secondary pricing structures for specific medication classes equivalent to documented street values for the same compounds. Solvent extraction of active compounds from topical institutional preparations, including certain medicated shampoos and skin creams, has been documented in confiscated written instructions circulated within facilities, providing step-by-step processes using only heat sources and improvised filtering materials available in a standard cell. Fermented caffeine concentrates from commissary coffee and tea have been documented as additives used to intensify the effects of other available intoxicants, functioning as a stimulant compound in the same way commercial products combine multiple active ingredients. The supply chain didn't end at the wall. It started over on the other side using the institutional nutmeg that nobody thought to classify as a security concern. 26 prison art programs exist to keep people occupied and to provide a therapeutic outlet for a population under significant psychological stress. Ceramics, painting, drawing, metalwork offered as vocational training. The institution provides the materials, the instruction, and the space. The documented secondary functions of those programs within the facilities that offer them constitute a fairly comprehensive industrial use case that administrators were not intending to fund. Ceramic programs have produced documented cases of mold making from institutional clay, including molds for weapon handle components, geometric blanks for subsequent fabrication steps, and in one documented case, a face cast used as the structural basis for a prosthetic disguise element. Painting programs have produced documented stockpiling of excess pigment accumulated over weeks of legitimate program participation, later combined to produce dyes, inks, and coating compounds used in unrelated fabrication projects requiring color matching or documentation forgery. Metalworking programs offered as vocational training have been documented as the origin point for confiscated tools and weapons whose fabrication method clearly reflected the application of skills acquired during legitimate instructional sessions to projects conducted outside program hours. Art supply paper from institutional programs has been documented as the medium for producing forged institutional documents, including movement authorization passes, medication approval forms, and, in documented cases, paperwork forgeries, sophisticated enough to require forensic examination to detect and reject. The art program wasn't therapy and rehabilitation, it was a funded fabrication research and development operation. The institution paid for the equipment, the materials, and the instruction. The population chose the curriculum. 27. If someone makes a weapon in prison, the intent is lethal. The weapon and the killing are a conceptual package, inseparable in the institutional framework that governs how contraband weapons are classified, responded to, and discussed in policy. The documented majority of improvised prison weapons recovered during routine facility searches were never deployed in violence of any kind. Criminological analysis of contraband weapon confiscations consistently finds that weapons recovered in non-incident searches outnumber weapons recovered as assault evidence by a significant margin, which supports the deterrence function as the primary use case rather than the offensive application. Documented warning weapons, instruments specifically designed to cause localized injury without producing permanent damage, appear in correctional incident records as enforcement mechanisms within internal economic systems, used to signal consequences without crossing the institutional and legal threshold that a homicide produces. Stun-type weapons built from battery components extracted from contraband electronics have been documented as non-lethal deterrence instruments, producing incapacitation sufficient for a momentary tactical advantage without the institutional consequence cascade that a knife attack generates. The economics of violence within correctional facilities create documented pressure toward restraint. A killing triggers lockdown, extended investigation, additional prosecution, and institutional consequences affecting the entire population. The documented institutional preference in inmate-on-inmate conflict is for force, calibrated to achieve a specific objective without activating the full institutional response. The goal was never to kill anyone. The goal was to have a conversation with someone who had decided not to have it voluntarily. The weapon was the meeting request. The distinction matters more than it sounds. 28. Food in prison has two documented institutional uses, consumption and barter. Someone eats it or someone trades it. The documented material applications of institutional food supplies in correctional fabrication projects constitute a third category that the institution did not design for and has never fully closed off. Bread dough softened with water and packed into joint gaps and surface cracks in cell walls has been documented as a structural fill material, hardening over days into a compound visually indistinguishable from institutional plaster at standard inspection distances used to conceal modification work or create false surfaces covering storage voids. Soap and food composite materials, soap base mixed with oatmeal, rice, or bread paste in varying ratios, have been documented in confiscated form as molding compounds capable of taking impressions of keys during brief supervised handling, producing a casting material functionally equivalent to jeweler's wax assembled entirely from cafeteria ingredients. Cafeteria sugar cooked to a hard caramel state using radiator heat has been documented as a contact adhesive strong enough to bond fabric to fabric and paper to paper for document and disguise fabrication purposes, a compound that is undetectable by smell or visual inspection after cooling. Food coloring compounds from institutional condiment packets have been documented as pigment sources for document forgery ink, tattoo pigment formulation, and camouflage paint used to match surface modifications to the surrounding institutional color environment. In a materials science context, the prison cafeteria is a fully stocked component supply depot. The packaging just says lunch instead of raw materials, which is the only labeling difference that matters to the institution. 29. Prison labor programs exist because administrators design them. Workshops, agricultural operations, manufacturing arrangements that generate institutional revenue and provide structured activity for the population. The institution designed the economy, and the institution runs it. The documented record of inmate organized economic activity within correctional facilities, predating formal programs by decades in many cases, suggests a different sequence of events. Informal service economies within correctional populations, including laundry services, tutoring, legal document preparation, translation, and barbering, have been documented operating with price structures, service quality standards, and informal dispute resolution mechanisms that predate the formal institutional programs that eventually appeared in the same facilities. The jailhouse lawyer, an inmate specializing in legal research and document preparation for other inmates as a compensated professional service, predates the formal provision of institutional legal aid by decades in documented cases, operating with reputation-based quality signaling and documented fee structures calibrated to the commissary economy. Physical training services, inmates with specific athletic backgrounds, providing structured programs to other inmates for commissary compensation, have been documented as organized economic activity with session pricing, package arrangements, and outcome-based reputation systems, indistinguishable in structure from small business service models operating in free markets. The organizational sophistication of these informal systems, including documented conflict resolution arbitration, protection service arrangements, and informal insurance mechanisms against theft or assault, represents a parallel governance structure that in some documented facilities exercise more effective behavioral control over the population than the formal administrative system. The administration thought it was running the facility. It was running the building. The people inside were running everything else. 30. Constant surveillance eliminates privacy, and privacy is the prerequisite for secret communication. Under camera coverage, in a monitored environment, with regular searches and documented movement, nothing can be hidden for long enough to matter. Documented communication systems operating inside surveilled correctional environments demonstrate that constant observation doesn't eliminate covert channels. It creates predictable blind spots, and predictable blind spots are the foundational resource of every effective covert communication architecture. Camera coverage analysis performed by inmates through systematic observation of which areas generate guard response and which do not has been documented as a primary planning activity, producing informal spatial maps of blind spot zones used for communication handoffs, contraband transfer, and fabrication work. Dead drop systems, the placement and retrieval of physical messages or items at fixed concealed locations, have been documented as primary communication channels in high camera density environments with transfer protocols timed to camera pan cycle gaps measured through repeated behavioral observation over weeks. Communication during authorized group activities, including exercise yard movement, religious services, and legal consultations, has been documented as the primary channel window, with message passing conducted under cover of legitimate social interaction during the precise periods when documentation of conversation content is restricted by institutional or constitutional policy. Steganographic communication embedding encoded messages in drawings, letter spacing patterns, book marginalia, and word selection in correspondence has been documented as surviving complete mail reading procedures, because detection requires possession of the key, not just the ability to read the content. Surveillance doesn't eliminate privacy, it relocates it to the gap between where the camera points and where it doesn't. That gap is the most valuable operational real estate in the entire facility. 31. The library is quiet, it's supervised, it's stocked with books. Institutionally, it is the most clearly benign space in the facility. Nobody is building anything useful in a room full of donated paperbacks and a sign asking for quiet. Documented cases across multiple facilities identify the library as a consistently productive location for fabrication intelligence, communication activity, and material sourcing, specifically because its institutional reputation as benign reduces the scrutiny applied to activity occurring there. Technical books available through standard library holdings, including chemistry references, electrical engineering guides, and architectural texts, have been documented as primary research sources for fabrication projects, with specific pages committed to memory during authorized reading sessions and later applied to tool, weapon, or structural modification work. Bookbinding adhesive used in the institutional maintenance of library holdings has been documented as a sourced bonding compound, providing a stronger adhesive than food-based alternatives for fabrication purposes requiring durable joins. The library's paper supply, available through writing programs, legal correspondence support, and educational materials, has been documented as the primary source of blank stock for document forgery projects where specific institutional paperweights and textures were required to match official formats. The relative individual privacy of authorized reading, which reduces observation pressure compared to group spaces where social interaction invites monitoring, has been documented as a functional attraction of library use for planning sessions, conducted between participants sitting in adjacent seating under cover of parallel individual activity. They didn't go to the library for the books. They went for access to organized information and socially enforced quiet, which is the same reason everyone else goes to a library. 32. The power structure in a correctional facility flows one direction, administration down. Institutional policy determines conditions, staffing, access, outcomes, and options. The population being managed has no leverage over any of those variables. The documented history of inmate organized collective action across correctional facilities in multiple countries tells a more complicated story about where leverage actually lives in a closed institutional system. The Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 produced documented policy concessions subsequently implemented at New York State facilities, establishing a legal and historical precedent that organized inmate collective action could produce institutional change and providing a documented operational template for structured negotiation from a position of physical containment. Hunger strikes, requiring no resources, no contraband, no coordination technology beyond word of mouth, have produced documented policy responses including nutritional standard reviews, administrative investigations, and in documented cases in the United States, Ireland, and the United Kingdom, early release processes as direct responses to sustained collective action. Information campaigns coordinated between institutional populations and external advocacy organizations through legal correspondence channels. Passing documented evidence of conditions to journalists and legal organizations have produced documented investigative journalism resulting in legislative responses. Work stoppages in correctional industry operations, where institutional manufacturing or agricultural programs are suspended through collective non-participation, have been documented as producing measurable economic pressure, with facilities losing external contracts and revenue that historically influenced administrative responsiveness to population concerns. They had no vote, no retained counsel, no public platform, and no physical freedom. They built a functional political toolkit anyway. That's not powerlessness with a different name. That's a different kind of power operating under different constraints. 33. Without access to medical professionals or proper clinical supplies, inmate self-treatment is desperate amateur intervention. Someone applies the wrong thing, skips a step they don't know about, and makes the injury worse. The institution provides the medical function. Without it, people guess badly. The documented reality of informal inmate medical networks within correctional facilities challenges the assumption that medical competency requires institutional provision rather than institutional context. Jailhouse medicine networks, documented informal systems in which inmates with prior medical training, paramedic certification, or nursing backgrounds provided services to other inmates, have been identified as primary de facto healthcare providers in facilities where institutional medical staffing was documented as inadequate to population demand. Wound closure using improvised suture materials, including dental floss, thread pulled from uniform seams, and in documented cases carefully cleaned hair, has appeared in correctional medical records as the initial treatment applied before institutional medical attention reached the patient, with documented outcomes in minor wound categories equivalent to facility-provided care. Pharmacological knowledge circulating within inmate populations has been documented at levels that surprised institutional administrators during medication audits. Inmates demonstrating specific knowledge of drug interactions, contraindications, and dosing thresholds for institutional medications, at a level the official distribution protocols did not anticipate the population possessing. Triage and diagnostic skill development, driven by the institutional necessity of identifying which injuries required immediate professional attention and which could be managed within available resources, has been documented through post-release case studies as producing functional emergency assessment competency in individuals who enter the system with no formal medical background. They didn't have a hospital. So they built a clinic out of accumulated experience and the specific educational incentive of having no acceptable alternative. 34. Mapping a correctional facility from the inside is logistically impossible. An inmate has access to their cell, their authorized movement corridor, and the specific locations their daily routine covers. Facility-wide spatial knowledge requires facility-wide access, which the institution specifically and structurally prevents. Documented facility maps produced by inmate populations and recovered during post-incident investigations have demonstrated accuracy sufficient to guide multi-point simultaneous actions, identify structural vulnerabilities, and coordinate escape operations produced entirely from accumulated observational fragments assembled through communication networks rather than individual access. Composite mapping technique, where individual inmates contribute observational data about their specific authorized movement areas, and a compiled document is assembled through a communication network, has been documented as the primary method for producing facility-wide spatial intelligence from individually limited perspectives. Dimensional estimation from movement timing, calculating corridor lengths from measured pace walk times, room dimensions from step counts, and ceiling heights from sound reflection characteristics, has been documented as producing maps accurate within measurable tolerances when compared against actual facility blueprints recovered during these same investigations. Architectural inference from external observation, identifying structural elements, utility runs, and load-bearing points from visible features observed during authorized outdoor movement periods, has been documented as providing the structural skeleton onto which interior observational layers were mapped. Privileged access exploitation, where inmates assigned to custodial, maintenance, or kitchen roles with broader facility movement authorization served as primary data collectors for mapping operations, has been documented as a systematic intelligence collection strategy, with assignment to those roles as an intentional operational goal. They didn't have a blueprint. They built one from what 40 different people could each see from where they were standing. 35. Given enough time, every inmate is working on getting out. The escape plan is the organizing project of long-term incarceration, the fantasy that gives structure and purpose to otherwise unstructured time. This is the institutional assumption. The documented behavioral record of long-term incarcerated individuals challenges it in ways that the escape mythology doesn't account for. The documented catalog of improvised fabrication projects within correctional facilities includes a substantial category of inventions oriented entirely toward improving conditions within the institution, with no application to escape, no connection to external activity, and no function beyond making the immediate living environment more tolerable. Heating modifications using improvised resistance elements to warm food or provide ambient heat in cold cells represent a documented fabrication category requiring significant technical skill and carrying zero escape application. Audio systems built from paper cone speakers and wire coils connected to institutional radio receivers requiring weeks of skilled effort have been documented as fabrication projects undertaken purely to improve sound quality during authorized entertainment periods. Furniture modifications including improvised additional shelving, improved mattress support structures, and repositioned reading light arrangements represent documented fabrication efforts with no function outside the immediate residential environment. Social infrastructure organized by inmate populations, including structured educational programs, book groups, athletic competitions, and cultural events, represents institutional community building documented as producing measurable improvements in mental health outcomes developed and operated by the population for the population without administrative initiation. Most of them weren't trying to get out, they were trying to make the inside livable. That is the harder problem, the less cinematic one, and the one nobody makes a documentary about. 36. The arms race between institutional security technology and inmate improvisation always resolves the same way. The institution deploys technology, the population encounters it. The technology wins because it has institutional resources, professional development, and a mandate behind it. The documented timeline of security technology deployments in correctional facilities and the corresponding documented workarounds shows a different resolution pattern than the institutional model predicts. Body scanner deployment, implemented to detect internal contraband concealment, was met within documented timeframes by packaging modifications that distributed contraband across multiple individuals at quantities and configurations below individual detection thresholds, requiring simultaneous coordinated smuggling to aggregate sufficient volume, a logistic solution that the scanner addressed not at all. Cell phone jammer installation, deployed in direct response to documented contraband phone proliferation, was met by transition to devices operating on frequencies outside the jammer's specified coverage range, a response requiring only awareness of the jammer's technical specification and access to alternative hardware through the existing supply chain. Bite-resistant food service packaging, deployed to prevent food from being processed into tool material, produced documented cases of inmates identifying alternative packaging materials not covered by the updated specification, relocating the problem without eliminating it. Artificial intelligence communication monitoring deployed to detect coded language in correspondence has been documented as driving a shift towards steganographic methods operating below the threshold of linguistic pattern detection, moving the competition into a domain where the documented advantage currently sits with human creative adaptation over algorithmic analysis. The facility that believes it has won the arms race has forced an upgrade it doesn't know is already in development. 37. Prison riots are spontaneous. Accumulated pressure reaches a threshold, something triggers the release, and chaos follows. Leaderless, unstructured, driven by emotion rather than objective, resolving through exhaustion or intervention rather than completion of any coherent goal. The documented structure of large-scale collective violence in correctional facilities consistently contradicts this characterization when examined against the post-incident record rather than the immediate news narrative. The Attica uprising included documented sequential seizure of specific facility sectors in a coordinated order, with different participant groups assigned specific objectives. Hostage management conducted according to apparent operational rules, and a negotiating committee that functioned with explicit authority to speak for the collective, none of which characterizes unplanned spontaneous disorder. Communication during documented collective actions has been found to have operated through pre-established signal systems, specific sounds or movements, triggering pre-assigned responses from distributed participants, demonstrating planning that required both a command structure and distributed operational preparation conducted before the initiating event. Objective prioritization during documented uprisings, securing communication infrastructure first, controlling medical facilities, neutralizing specific security points in sequence rather than simultaneously, demonstrates strategic thinking, rather than opportunistic destruction of whatever was nearest. Negotiating positions presented during documented uprisings have appeared with specific numbered demands, conditional acceptance structures, and proposed monitoring mechanisms, documents of sufficient specificity to have required prior drafting during the planning phase, rather than composition under operational conditions. It was not a riot, it was a military operation with a political objective. The distinction between the two is determined primarily by which side of the legal boundary the participants were standing on when it started. 38. Producing counterfeit currency or forged documents requires printing presses, security paper, specialized inks, and industrial equipment that is categorically unavailable inside a controlled correctional environment. The supply chain for counterfeiting ends at the intake processing point. Pre-digital era prison counterfeiting documented in federal records from the mid-20th century involved hand-drawn currency reproductions of sufficient technical accuracy to pass in low-light commercial transactions, produced by inmates who applied technical study of genuine currency geometry, proportion, and line weight to reproductions executed using available marking instruments. Photographic reproduction techniques using institutional camera equipment available through documentation programs, educational photography courses, or confiscated personal cameras have been documented as producing document facsimiles capable of passing inspection by individuals without forensic training in document authentication. Modern digital counterfeiting using institutional computer access available through educational programs, legal research terminals, and vocational training has been documented in cases where inmates scanned institutional documents, modified content using basic image editing functionality available in standard software, and printed reproductions on institutional printers during authorized access periods. Security feature simulation, reproducing watermarks through layered paper manipulation, metallic security strips through foil sourced from food service packaging, and color shift visual elements through layered translucent materials, has been documented in confiscated materials, representing deliberate technical study of anti-counterfeiting measures and systematic attempts to reproduce them using what was available. The printing press is optional equipment. What counterfeiting actually requires is detailed knowledge of the target document and sufficient time to achieve accuracy. One of those was always going to be there, the other one was never in short supply. 39. Ligature-resistant fixture design addresses the anchor point problem comprehensively. Rounded edges, recessed hardware, no horizontal surfaces that can support a fixed line. The engineering removes the physical preconditions for certain categories of risk, and by extension, the materials and anchor points required for any vertical movement or rigging application. Documented improvised climbing and rigging equipment produced in ligature-resistant environments demonstrates that removing the obvious anchor points drives the problem to anchor points, so counterintuitive, they were never included in the design specification. Climbing hardware, documented in ligature-resistant environments, includes grappling systems assembled from braided uniform fabric, anchored to door frame gaps measured in millimeters, window frame edges identified as structurally load-bearing through systematic pressure testing, and in one documented case, a conduit access panel found to have sufficient structural integrity to bear the required load. The material shift in ligature-resistant environments from fabric to non-fabric rigging using knotted food service plastic strips, braided dental floss, and deconstructed shoe material components represents documented adaptation to a specific design constraint through material substitution rather than technique abandonment. Vertical movement motivation in non-escape contexts includes documented purposes: accessing elevated storage spaces, reaching communication points near ceiling-mounted ventilation, and in one documented case, reaching a ceiling-mounted camera to physically obstruct its coverage using an improvised occluder. The architectural documentation of ligature-resistant design consistently identifies the engineering trade-off. The removal of known anchor points resolves the documented risk category while creating an unresolved problem of mechanical creativity that migrates to whatever the design specification did not explicitly address. The designer removed the obvious anchor points. The engineer on the other side found the non-obvious ones. This is the same problem facing every security system optimized against the last documented attack. 40. Soap is a hygiene product. In a correctional institutional context, it is one of the least operationally interesting items in the facility. It cleans things. That is the complete functional description. The documented material applications of institutional soap in correctional fabrication projects constitute a catalog that covers casting, fastening, currency, concealment compound, and structural repair, and still has entries left over. Soap molding for key impressions, pressing a key briefly against a soap surface during a supervised handling moment and using the negative impression as a casting template in harder material, is documented in correctional incident records with sufficient frequency that supervised key handling protocols were revised at multiple facilities specifically to address it. Soap hardened through extended drying and sustained compression has been documented as a fabrication material for handles, weighted inserts, and in several documented cases, blunt instrument components. The cured material achieving a density comparable to dense plastic when processed correctly under the right conditions. Soap dissolved in water and mixed with powdered material to produce a paste that hardens on drying has been documented as a gap fill, and surface restoration compound used to conceal cell wall modifications, tool marks, and evidence of fabrication activity from visual inspection at standard distances. In documented accounts from Soviet-era detention facilities, soap bars functioned as a standardized unit of value in informal exchange economies, selected not for their specific utility as soap, but because they met the portability and divisibility requirements of commodity currency more reliably than food-based alternatives in that specific institutional context. They looked at a bar of soap and saw a materials science problem with multiple solution paths. The institution saw hygiene. That gap in perspective is the entire story of this catalog compressed into one object. 41. The administration has information asymmetry working in its favor: surveillance equipment, informant networks, administrative oversight, movement tracking, communication monitoring. The institution knows what is happening inside the facility. Control requires information, and the institutional apparatus was specifically designed to gather it comprehensively. Administrative accounts and post-incident investigations from correctional facilities across multiple countries and eras consistently reveal that the institutional picture of what was actually happening inside the facility lagged actual activity by periods measured in months to years, and that the intelligence picture administrators believed they had was being managed from the other side. Counter-informant networks, documented systems for identifying and managing individuals suspected of providing information to administration, have been described in inmate accounts and confirmed in post-incident investigations as operating with sufficient organizational sophistication to neutralize institutional informant programs for extended periods by controlling what information reached the informant in the first place. Staged compliance, the systematic practice of maintaining visible conformance to institutional expectations in all observed spaces while conducting actual operational activity in identified blind spots, has been documented as a behavioral strategy that exploits the institutional tendency to treat absence of detected violation as evidence of actual compliance. Information managed through known informant channels, deliberately false or selectively accurate content provided to identified informants for transmission to administration, has been documented as a technique for shaping the institutional intelligence picture and directing investigative attention away from active operations. Post-incident investigations following major events at multiple facilities have consistently documented institutional surprise at the scope and duration of activity that had been occurring undetected, with after-action reports describing systematic intelligence failures rather than exceptional concealment by the population. The warden thought they were running a surveillance operation. They were running a stage set. The actual facility was operating just outside the frame. 42. The institution processes people through and releases them, either improved by programming or unchanged by indifference. Either way, The individual is the variable the system acts on. The institution is the container. The container is neutral. The documented catalog of adaptive invention produced by incarcerated individuals across 2 centuries and dozens of countries. The engineering, chemistry, organizational design, cartography, communication architecture, economic structure, and political action documented across this list represents something more specific than ingenuity under pressure. It represents a consistent, reproducible human response to extreme constraint that produces capability the individuals did not necessarily possess before the constraint was applied. Longitudinal studies of individuals who engaged in high-complexity fabrication and organizational activity during incarceration have documented skill transfers to post-release contexts, engineering problem-solving approaches, organizational leadership competencies, and economic management skills applied in legal settings after release from individuals whose pre-incarceration records showed none of those capabilities. The prison economy, commodity currency, credit instruments, price discovery mechanisms, contract enforcement systems, documents a functional economic education occurring in a zero-resource environment, producing financial literacy in individuals who entered the system without it. The social organization required to navigate correctional facility hierarchy, dispute resolution, resource allocation under scarcity, and collective action under institutional opposition mirrors the organizational challenges of any human community and produces documented adaptive competency that transfers across contexts. The fabrication catalog, from razor blade compasses to functioning boats, from crystal radios to composite mapping systems, represents physics, chemistry, biology, and engineering applied to problems of survival and comfort without access to any of the institutional supports those disciplines normally require. The institution thought it was containing people. It was running the most intensive applied engineering and social science curriculum ever operated without a faculty, a budget, or anyone's consent. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.